Welcome, everyone. We're going to start with some short introductions while a few more people enter the room. But yeah, thank you so much for joining our first CREA China webinar. We're really delighted to have you all. My name is Belinda Sherpa, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm a China analyst with CREA. And I'm really delighted today to be joined by my colleague, co-founder and lead analyst, Larry Milliverter, and my China analyst colleague, Qin to discuss China's two sessions that just concluded in Beijing a few weeks ago and the way ahead for the energy transition in China. For those of you who are not familiar with CREA, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, we're an independent think tank working at the nexus of energy transition and air pollution and providing some of the most up-to-date data-driven analysis on China's energy transition. So today we want to look at what happened in Beijing just a couple of weeks ago and what it means for China's energy transition, especially in this year. 2025 will be quite critical, given it's the last year of the 14th five-year plan and the preparations for the 15th five-year plan. But also, as many of you are surely aware, the year where China is going to submit the climate targets for the next decade for its nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC in 2035. So really, it's a year where a lot of things are going to happen and a lot of things are going to determine the trajectory, not only of China's energy transition, but the global energy transition more broadly. And all of that happens in a very volatile geopolitical environment with many tense discussions around energy security and clean tech competition. So we hope this will be useful for you to dive into some of the intricate dynamics that are happening in China at the moment, what we are looking at, looking back on where we got here, but also looking forward on what to expect for the year to come. So we will start with a conversation with Larry and T, and then there will be ample of time for all of you to raise your questions that we haven't answered in that conversation yet. So feel free to also drop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom, and then we will come to them during the Q&A session. Right, but without any further ado, let's dive into it. So, Larry, you published these very insightful quarterly analysis with Carbon Brief on China's emission trends. They are a very useful resource for any of you who are not aware of them. And the most recent analysis in January found that China's clean energy actually kept CO2 emissions below the previous year's 10 months in 2024. So I'd be really keen for you to talk us a bit through it. Where are we at the moment in terms of the emissions trajectory? Also, especially to the question that people ask us a lot of, has China actually peaked emissions yet? Or when are we reaching the peak? That's the question we always get discussed. So yeah, give us a bit of a download where we're at in terms of emission trends at the moment.
Thanks so much, and good to see so many old and new friends in the attendees. So welcome. So I think I'll just start by saying that if you've seen the data for January, February this year, I haven't done the full assessment yet because the data is just trickling in. But it's a safe bet that emissions fell year on year in January, February simply because of the 6% drop in power generation from thermal power plants, so from coal and gas, and also an ongoing decline in cement production, steel production as well. So a very clear case there. So now we do have a 12-month period when emissions are flat or down year on year, starting from March 2024. That, of course, doesn't mean a peak. It's a clear break from the trend that we saw in 2020 to 2023. But it's to actually declare that emissions have peaked, they must fall so far below the peak level that it's almost impossible, or at least very hard to imagine how they would go back up and reach another peak. So we are quite some ways away from that. The really important thing that I've been emphasizing since 2023 is that the clean energy growth that has taken place in China over the past few years, or the further acceleration from the already high level that the industry was at before then, that makes it possible. That means that for the first time, there's a way for the numbers to add up to a continuous structural decline in fossil fuel consumption, because the growth in clean energy is at a scale where it can um, uh, supply all of the growth in not just electricity demand, but energy demand. However, the big catch to that is that energy demand has been growing at much higher rates, especially relative to GDP, over the past 4 years than it did before. Um, so in the um, during the previous decade, um, energy consumption growth averaged much about half, significantly below the growth rate of GDP. Since 2020, since the start of the COVID pandemic, the energy consumption growth rate has been almost at par with the GDP growth rate. So China's energy economic growth pattern has been far more energy intensive than before that. Now the big question going forward, well, there are two big questions. I'm going to talk about the one of them later. So the two big questions are: is the clean energy boom going to continue or accelerate? And the other one is what's going to happen with energy demand. So is this abnormally rapid growth of the past few years, is that some kind of a new normal that just means that China's economic growth also in the next years is going to come from these energy intensive manufacturing sectors? Or is it in fact a distortion to the structure of the economy that was caused by the zero COVID period, the hit to the service sectors, to household spending power, and so on, the real estate contraction, that that actually means that we should expect a period when the economic um, structure returns to trend, and growth comes disproportionately from the low energy intensive sectors. And When I was last in Beijing and spoke to people who are modeling this for the government and for the think tanks, this they were very much preoccupied by this question and very much shell shocked by the rapid energy demand growth. So this is something that wasn't in anyone's books. And it's very clear if you go back to 2020, 2021, the agenda that Xi Jinping was setting for implementing the CO2 peaking and carbon neutrality, emphasizing dual control of energy consumption and so on, that this was not that whole agenda was not informed by what was in the cards. So this big disconnect between economic policy and energy policy. That there's a whole history of that in China, but I think there's a pretty big possibility that it's going to play in the other direction now that people are operating from the assumption that rapid energy demand will continue, planning for that, and heading into another period of overcapacity. The previous time that happened was the 12th 5-year plan. Um, I th so that's as much of an answer that I'm going to be able to to give, there's a very real possibility of emissions having at least reached a plateau, even starting to come down structurally. But that depends heavily on the economic policy direction that is set this year for the coming years, and on the targets for clean energy and emissions that are set in the NDC and the 5-year plan. And well, I'll say one more thing about this, which is that if China is going to meet the carbon intensity target that it's committed to under the Paris Agreement, that means that emissions have to come down from the 2024 level to 2030. So depending on what you assume about GDP, if we assume 5% average GDP growth, there's the need for emissions to fall a couple of percent over this period. If you assume that GDP growth will continue to slow down, which I think is more likely, so let's say 4%, then you need a 6% drop in CO2 emissions in absolute terms from 2024 to 2030. So, and this is very, very different from what everyone assumed when the carbon intensity target was set. And I think there is currently, I'm very concerned about the fact that all the emphasis and the attention is on the dual carbon goals. So talking about CO2 peaking before 2030, whereas the carbon intensity goal is much more demanding. It means there needs to be a significant absolute reduction already by 2030. So I'm concerned that this is being brushed aside a bit, and kind of the government is at least, or the leadership is at least preparing for the possibility that they're going to miss the 2030 carbon intensity target. And so this is for diplomatic and diplomatic efforts for reporting on China. Keeping the carbon intensity goal in the picture is incredibly important.
Thanks so much, Larry, for this really helpful overview. Also, how it really developed over the last couple of years and how we got where we are, and highlighting the role of the carbon intensity target. Because as your analysis suggests, also we are very much off track for the 2025, both carbon intensity and energy intensity, the way it was defined when the goal was set. So looking ahead to 2030, it's really quite critical to ensure that there is some kind of pressure for the government to actually follow through on some of these. And of course, the coal power sector is one of the key ones in the next 5 years, but also beyond that. She has just published a really great report as part of our biannual reports looking at the coal power sector developments, which found that there is still a continued build out of coal. In fact, there was a new high, 10-year high in new construction starts. And you looked as well into the role of long-term coal power purchase agreement and mining companies, how they are driving some of these developments. Qi, do you want to talk us a bit through what your key findings were from the report, what happened in 2024 more broadly, and why is China still building out some of these coal power plants? What are some of the dynamics behind that?
Yeah, thank you, Belinda. And hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. As Laurie mentioned, that in recent years, in the past few years, the energy demand is soaring up. And recently, like both coal production and coal consumption in China have been growing both rapidly. During the last 5-year period, which is the 13th 5-year plan period from 2016 to 2020, the coal consumption actually only increased by around 8%. And if you count from 2015, just 1 year earlier, the coal consumption increased only 1% by 2020, so barely changed. But from 2021 to 2024, it jumped by over 20%. So we can see how fast the energy demand is growing in the past few years. So this clearly goes against China's and Xi Jinping's earlier promise about to strictly and reasonably control coal consumption during the 14th 5-year period. Looking at 2024 specifically, coal supply growth has slowed somewhat comparing with 2023 and 2022. Coal supply increased by about 2% in 2024, compared with 10% in 2022. But the coal demand continues to grow strongly by more than 5%, which makes 2024 one of the highest years of coal demand growth, coal consumption growth in the past decade. I think it's only behind the pandemic years of 2021 and 2022. So only over about 95% of coal in China is used in industry, and more than half goes to the power generation. Although China committed earlier in 2021 to strictly limit new coal power projects, but the power shortages caused by the 2022 drought. And of course, it's not actually caused by the hydro decline from the drought, but rather it's the inflexible grid operations in China. This has led to a policy shift. The power shortages had at that time led to a policy shift. So since that time, the province have been given the green light to approve a large number of coal power plants. Over 100 gigawatts of new coal power plants was approved each year in 2022 and 2023. So last year, 2024, the pace has slowed down a bit, but approval still reached more than 66 gigawatts. And meanwhile, as Belinda mentioned in the beginning, that the coal power under construction hit 95 gigawatts. That is the highest level since 2015. And at the same time, we all see that China's renewable energy growth has been truly impressive. Between 2023 and 2024, the newly added solar and wind capacity has reached around 650 gigawatts. So that is more than EU's entire existing solar and wind fleet. But despite this, the coal power is still expanding in parallel, and this creates pressure and uncertainty for clean energy development in China. So one reason behind that is I think it's the coal interest groups, including the coal mining companies, the transport sector, and the coal traders. They have a strong stake in the power market. So they are trying to maximize their profits before the carbon peaking. They know they don't have much time. They are moving very quickly to secure the growth before the window narrows. So for now, the coal power still enjoys very strong policy protections. Every year, the large coal power plants secure about 18% of their expected generation through the long-term contracts organized by the government. This, of course, limits the room for renewables to grow their share. Laurie mentioned that since March 2024, we didn't see emission growth from the power sector in China. We didn't see much of the emission growth, but we also noticed that in November 2024, even with good weather conditions, we saw higher than expected curtailment of wind and solar power. And also earlier in Sichuan, despite the strong hydro output and the stable demand, coal power generation increased sharply in September. This all simply because of the need to fulfill the long-term coal contracts signed at the start of the year. So without this large percentage of long-term coal contracts, the clean energy should have more potential in to get a bigger share in the power mix. So and another trend in 2024 that worth to watching is that more coal companies are moving into power generation. Many of the coal projects approved in 2023 and 2024 are so-called coal and coal power integration projects. They are often located near the coal mines, and this made up about 30% of all coal power approvals in 2024, up from 31% in the previous year. So, for example, like China Coal, one of the biggest state-owned coal companies, is now planning to build over 16 gigawatts of coal power. So that will make it second only to the 5 largest power generation groups in China. Yeah, so in summary, 2024 has shown that coal interests are moving quickly to secure their place just before the carbon peak. And this has driven a further expansion of coal power capacity and made it harder for the clean energy to further replace coal in the power mix.
Thanks so much, Chi. Yeah, I think these dynamics are really important to understand because, like you say, there are also big lobby groups behind that, right? There are a lot of interests at stake, and it's in a way climbing to the peak to get the most out of it until there really has to be a hard cut. And of course, your report also showed that it's very much in contrast with what is happening in the rest of the world. China now accounts for 93% of global construction starts for coal power plants. So that's something also probably quite valuable to point out in diplomatic discussions. And I know many of you have taken those on board as well. The other side, of course, T, you already mentioned the renewables expansion, which continued rapidly in 2024, hitting 350 gigawatts of newly added solar and wind, which is really quite stunning. I think no one really expected that, and it's just so high that it's really incomparable with anything that's built out in the rest of the world. So our recent analysis, I think Larry, you posted about that as well, suggests that the numbers for the first few months of this year might be even higher than last year. And you and T and our colleague Cheng Cheng also looked into how these sectors are now starting to, not only starting to, but really becoming a central part of the economy and have driven 10% of GDP growth in 2024, and looked into that. Can you talk us a bit through what are some of the trends when it comes to clean energy more broadly? So renewables, but also nuclear and storage. Also, perhaps with some of the most recent pricing policies that we have seen. I think many people are trying to make sense of what the implications of that are, but also how these sectors are contributing to the economy and what that also means for decision makers in Beijing.
For sure. So yeah, first of all, the numbers for January, February for capacity additions just came out late last week. So solar was even up a bit from last year, which was wild as a year. 280 gigawatts of solar added in total. The first 2 months, so 39 gigawatts, which is, so it's worth highlighting. There are only 5 countries in the world other than China that have more solar in total than China added in 2 months. So the scale is staggering. And for wind, it was also coming in at par with last year. So the big thing, well, there are two big things happening this year. It's obviously the target year for the 5-year plan, which means a lot of the, especially the Western clean energy bases are racing to hit capacity targets. And then there's the new pricing policy for new clean energy plants connecting to the grid starting from June, which so the effect of that it will be twofold. There's obviously a big incentive for projects to try and connect before the deadline. And for solar, where the turnaround is really quick, that can even mean that there's still time to initiate small projects that will then connect before the deadline. It's also there seems to be some uncertainty about how strict the deadline is. So there might be projects in the third quarter still getting in. So there will be a short-term speed up, but then there is uncertainty about how capacity additions will develop under the new pricing policy. So the way it works is there's, for every province, there is basically a quota of how much capacity they can hand out these contracts for difference for. So those projects that get a contract for difference will get a higher price for the electricity. That's tied to the targets for renewable energy consumption. So that this is a policy that is trying to tie clean energy development more back to the central government targets. In the past few years, the really key thing to keep in mind and understand is that solar and wind, especially solar, ran way ahead of the central government targets. And if that is to keep going, then the solar and wind producers will have to secure bilateral long-term contracts with buyers from a competitive market, where they have to compete against, for example, existing coal-fired power plants that also get capacity payments, and that are, as a sector, there's an oversupply of coal-fired power. So it's going to be a tough environment. However, looking at what the industry associations expect, the photovoltaic industry association, so the solar power panel manufacturers, expect a drop this year of about 10 to 20% from last year's very high levels. But that still means that this year would be 2023 for installations, and then they expect a recovery from there. The Wind Energy Association expects a big record this year. So last year was about 80 gigawatts. They expect this year to be above 100 gigawatts, and a lot of that coming from offshore wind, which has higher generation gigawatt for gigawatt. So overall, if those expectations are fulfilled, this year we'll still see the biggest additions of annual clean energy generation to the grid. And the Wind Energy Association also expects further slow growth from there to 2026 and beyond. But there's a lot of uncertainty about this. There's uncertainty that stems from the province level implementation. There is uncertainty that stems from the it's effective new market that is being created, so it's hard to predict. I think the stabilizing factor is what Belinda alluded to. So clean energy has become so significant economically that for a lot of provinces, for a lot of state-owned enterprises, and so on, if the market tanked and came down to the levels that the central government is currently targeting, that would be a big economic headwind. We also put out an analysis breaking this down, breaking the clean energy boom down to the province level, that just showed how it's far more important for some of the provinces than nationally as a whole. So that's an important dynamic. One thing that is underappreciated, I think, by a lot of people is the scale of storage that is coming online. There's almost 200 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage, and last year saw more than 30 gigawatts of battery storage being added to the grid. The catch with that is that because there isn't a functioning spot market that would create proper hour-to-hour price signals, there isn't an incentive for much of that storage to operate at all, and certainly not to operate in a way that would get the most benefit out of it for the power system. So creating that is a task that needs to happen in the next couple of years. So there's the aim of creating a new type power system by 2027, and that is going to rely a lot on storage, because the policy is that so-called main coal power plants shouldn't be doing a lot of adjustment to their output day to day, but they should be running oblivious of what's happening in the rest of the system. And then you have some flexible coal-fired and gas-fired power plants plus storage, plus the wind and solar operating in a flexible manner. So for that equation to work, you do have to introduce pricing mechanisms that make that incentivize storage working properly. Um, so on the level of targets, so because of the new pricing policy, they will probably play a more important role than they did in the past 5 years. I think the government has been um, uh, coming along a bit. So a year ago, the head of the National Energy Administration suggested that annual clean energy additions should be kept above 100 gigawatts, which last year more than 300 was added. So that was very, very far behind. Now the government is saying more than 200, but that's still much less than was added last year, and then is likely going to be added this year. So getting from there to a level that keeps the boom going is a really key thing. Yeah, I think those are the key points. Keen to get to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's my call also on all of you to put your questions into the Q&A, and then we'll come to those. I've already seen Anders' question. Before we get to that though, this webinar is called on the two sessions, so we're also going to talk about that. Obviously, some of the things mentioned in the government work report are also related to offshore wind and the large-scale basins in the desert that was specifically mentioned. But economic uncertainty ranked very high and was kind of overshadowing some of these dynamics. So, Qi, could you give us a bit of a take on what you think are the implications of the two sessions this year for the China's energy transition more broadly, but also emission trends, and then look a bit into the crystal ball of what you expect for 2025 based on that.
Thank you, Belinda. I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately. From China's two sessions, well, first, the policy signals from the two sessions were not very ambitious in terms of energy transition. The headline energy intensity target for 2025 is still a 3% reduction. But it's important to understand that the definition of energy intensity has been changed. It used to mean total energy consumption per unit of GDP. Now it only refers to fossil fuel consumption per GDP. So that change makes it much easier to achieve the 14th five-year plan goal of a 13.5% energy intensity reduction. It also means that the target no longer reflects the same level of effort or ambition. So since clean energy is excluded from the equation. And I think looking ahead into 2025, the government is expected to put more focus on improving the clean energy consumption, the utilization rate. And there's a new emphasis on local consumption of renewable power. And for the first time, the phrase use Western power in the West was mentioned in official documents. That suggests that China wants to better match supply and demand within provinces instead of just relying on long distance transmission from west to east. So, and at the same time, also, as Laurie mentioned, that 2025 is the final year of the 14th five-year plan. So the large-scale solar and wind project bases, they're expected to come online before the year ends. So we expect the solar and wind capacity to continue growing fast, if not faster than 2024, but roughly at the same pace as in 2023 and 2024. But however, there is still no clear policy signal to limit the coal consumption or stop approving new coal power projects. In fact, the NEA, National Energy Administration, they has repeated that its bottom line thinking on energy security. It aims to stable coal supply, keep crude oil output above 200 million tons, and continue expanding natural gas production. So the China National Coal Association, they even expected the coal consumption to rise slightly in 2025. Although coal prices have been falling since the beginning of this year, both coal production and imports are still increasing in the first 2 months. So industry groups are now calling for the limits on imported coal and tighter controls on domestic production. So that said, we are seeing some early signs of coal power generation declining, mainly thanks to the strong clean energy growth and also favorable weather recently. So if confidence and policy support for renewables continues, coal power could be pushed back further. Definitely has the potential to be pushed back further this year. So but as for non-power coal use, we don't expect much growth. The real estate and infrastructure activity remains weak, even though housing sales are picking up a bit, but that hasn't translated into more construction starts. So coal demand from cement and steel is likely to stay flat. But one area worth to watch is coal to chemicals. Last year, coal use in the coal chemical sector jumped about 10%, so even while other industries stayed weak. And this year, analysts expect coal chemicals demand to grow another 5%. So this could be a driver for coal demand, even if other sectors remain soft. Yeah, so to sum up, 2025, I think we'll likely see strong growth in clean energy capacity and some progress in integrating renewables more efficiently and effectively. But coal is still protected in policy, and we expect only a slow shift away from fossil fuels unless stronger actions is taken.
Thanks so much, Xi. I think that's a very good look ahead on trying to understand where we're headed this year and what the dynamics are. We have so far oh, Larry, do you want to add something? Yes, please go.
Yeah, just two things that I realized I wanted to cover, and that were kind of I hope are a good follow-up to C's remarks. So on the 3% target for energy intensity, or energy intensity excluding non-fossil energy and energy consumption for raw materials, as the full name is now. It's just the implications of that. That means that CO2 emissions could increase by more than 2% this year, and the target would still be met. So last year, CO2 emissions from energy were up 1.4%, and the National Bureau of Statistics still reported a 3.8% improvement in this fossil energy intensity. So that's not a serious target if you think about getting back on track to the carbon intensity goal, which requires that emissions go down in absolute terms, and carbon intensity improves more like 5% per year. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is I think I gave, or I want to put one caveat on talking about the yearly capacity additions, because the way that things are probably going to play out this year for wind and solar is that we have this big rush until June and maybe carrying a bit into the third quarter for wind and solar, and then we have a lot of the big centralized projects completing by the end of the year, but there is probably going to be a pretty significant slowdown, especially in distributed solar in the second half. And that's going to cause a lot of negative headlines, concern about the industry, and certainly worsen the situation in terms of oversupply and weak profitability and so on. So there's going to be a lot of negativity about that, and real financial distress in the sector probably. So it's important to remember that the annual totals aren't the full picture. And I'm happy to jump onto Anders' question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. As C explained, the curtailment, the jumping curtailment last year, especially October, November, seems to have related to these annual contracts that were being made. So the way it works is that the grid is supposed to buy all the electricity from wind and solar plants but when they've overcontracted coal, the penalties for breaching the coal power contracts are bigger than the implicit penalty that they face if they don't buy or if they don't dispatch the wind and solar. And so this is one thing that it will be changed by the new pricing policy. So apparently, one reason why the government moved so fast on the pricing policy is that it will, when the contracts, the form of the contracts becomes similar, then there isn't this perverse incentive for the grid to prioritize the coal contracts in this kind of a situation. In January, February, it doesn't look like this was happening. So the utilization of wind and solar was what we would expect based on the weather factors. And anyway, this specific driver for curtailment is an end of the year issue. So it could very well flare up again towards the end of the year if the year plays out the way that I expect, which is that power demand growth will surprise on the downside and these major clean energy additions happen throughout the year, and especially now they're being brought forward by the deadline of the pricing policy.
If if I may, I just want to add a little bit about Anders' question about distributed solar. So because in the previous few years, the distributed solar are carried out under the whole county distributed solar policy. And in that policy, the highest level utilized buildings are government buildings and public facility buildings, like account for 15% of those buildings need to be installed distributed solar power. But as the consumption issue become more serious, so we expect that the situation will change a bit. So for those public facilities, rooftop and residential rooftop, because their consumption ability is not that is limited. So in 2025, we could possibly see more small scale business rooftop that they can consume all the distributed power that they have.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. And I see that Larry is already typing in response to Anders' follow-up question. So maybe I'll let Larry type and then you can all read the answer. There's one question from Annika on hydrogen. I don't know, Chi or Larry, if either of you have any more insights on what the recent policy support means. And she mentions the new fund by the NDRC on frontier technologies. To what extent is that an important boost? Maybe we can start with that one, and then there are two more questions by Nico and Sune as well. I don't know if who of you wants to take the hydrogen question.
Yeah, well, I don't have very specific visibility on the policy side. My expectation is that if and as the clean energy boom keeps going and the grid is struggling to accommodate that, I expect that the green hydrogen will start to happen faster as a way of creating, absorbing clean energies. So it's going to start happening faster than the central government game plan would have you expect. And certainly some important announcements about green hydrogen projects and pipelines and so on, kind of anticipating more policy support. But yeah, how much of that will be forthcoming is anyone's guess.
See, do you have any more thoughts on the hydrogen, or does that cover it broadly?
Yeah, I think Laurie answered it very well. I don't have anything to
add. Before we go back to some more questions on the curtailment, Nico raised the questions on policy signals on China's new NDC, whether China is planning to wait for the EU's NDC or what some of the ambition is. Larry, do you want to start with that? And maybe I can pitch in a bit as well.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the signals or the sense that I've at least gotten is that the policymakers have been quite cautious, especially about the headline CO2 or greenhouse gas target. So it's basically clear that there is going to be some kind of an absolute target for 2035, and it's clear that it's in some way it's going to cover all greenhouse gases. So the NDC will not necessarily the absolute emission target, but yeah, in terms of the level of ambition, um, what I've heard is quite a bit of caution, but it's been I at least don't have a sense since late last year how things have evolved in terms of the internal thinking. There is a bit more negotiation and coordination happening or engagement happening between China and the EU, and that would be really important for both sides. The whole point of delaying the NDC submissions was to enable um, uh, more of more of that to happen, and the EU certainly um, failed last year to articulate its expectations towards China. So there's work to do on that. I think the general expectation is that the NDC will come out in the autumn, perhaps around the UNGA or anyway before the UN Climate Conference.
Yes, I think that's as much as the insider knowledge that we can probably share. It's a very sensitive debate in China for obvious reasons, and it's very hard to get some good sense of what the dynamics are. There seems to be a lot of infighting as well between different ministries trying to push different priorities. So I think there's still room also to shape that through international pressure or international reporting on it. When the NDC deadline passed, I mean, I'm aware that's only a regulatory part of it, but there wasn't a lot of media attention or global attention to that at all. But I think now that we have a bit more time, at least until the autumn, um, there's more room to kind of shape that. And I know a lot of EU colleagues, also some of which are on the call, have been doing amazing work on trying to engage Chinese counterparts on that on the technical level or on a more policy level as well. So there's been a lot of talk, but I think really there can't be enough because as yeah, we try to stress in different analysis. It's really probably the most important climate target to be set yet, defining China's emissions trajectory after 2030 and where that's going to go. So it's really quite crucial. And this more time, I hope it allows us all to make the case for why a strong target is also in China's interest. And in terms of coordination between the EU and China, I think it looks likely that the EU's NDC is only going to come out in October with the current, yeah, the structures and processes. So it might be that China would wait for it, but I don't think we can answer that for sure. Right, then there was another question by Sune, more on the distributed, yeah, good distributed solar as well, and or distributed curtailments and wind curtailments on onshore wind. I don't know if either of you want to take that one. Sorry, should I read out the question?
No, I have it at least. So yeah, overall, yeah, solar wind seems to be where most of the curtailment is. And yeah, all I can say is that it's very hard. Like everyone who speaks to anyone in China has heard those examples of plants that are facing severe curtailment. Um, but it's very hard to get the aggregate picture because there's so little data. So one thing that I've done is I've done a global benchmarking looking at so these are the sites where China's wind power plants are found, and these are according to the Global Wind Atlas. These are the wind conditions in those plants. So this is how much they would be expected to run. So there's a ratio of the kind of ideal uh, operating hours and the actual ones. And so I did that benchmarking for all the countries in the world, and China was sitting somewhere very comfortably in the pack. So that doesn't, and that includes countries where we know that there isn't that curtailment is in the is less than 1%, and so on. So it doesn't suggest that there is like a huge unreported curtailment problem in China in the aggregate. Or then, Chinese wind turbines are just built so much better that they can, even with curtailment, they can generate more. But I don't think that's the case. So yeah, that's my why I've been going around telling people that ugly problematic examples aside, there isn't like a massive hidden curtailment problem in China, except for those specific periods and some provinces where it's usually reported as well. But that said, it was concerning that this unreported curtailment could happen at the end of last year, so that puts a question mark on the reliability of the data. And the other point is that there are two ways to look at curtailment. One of them is what does it mean for the aggregate energy balance of the country, and they're losing like 3% of the potential generation isn't a big deal. But if you're an investor expecting 8% return on an investment and you face 5% curtailment, then that's more than half of your profit gone, right? And if the average is 3%, then half of the plants are probably facing 2 times that, and quite a few of them are missing more than that. So it creates a lot of investment risk even at the reported levels because it's unpredictable, largely for the developer, how much they're going to face specifically.
Yes, I agree with Laurie. So if the curtailment is caused by the weather conditions, then there's not much that can be done. That's the nature of the renewables. But if the turbines are being shut down, even when the wind is available, there's a different story. That suggests that it's more of a grid dispatch and system integration issue rather than a resource problem. So I think with better grid flexibility and smarter dispatch, especially making use of flexible demand or storage, that clean energy could be used much more efficiently in China. Right now, the lack of dynamic scheduling and the rigid grid operations are limiting how much the green power can actually be absorbed, even near the major demand centers like Beijing and Tianjin.
Thanks so much, both. If there are any final questions, now is the time to submit them. I'll chat a bit more, and then we'll see if any other comes in. Otherwise, I think this is the first time we're trying this webinar format, so we hope it's useful for you. Do let us know what you think of it and if you want more formats like this. Otherwise, of course, you can always keep up to date through our newsletter and the website, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have at any time as well. We're here and try to answer them if we can and if time allows, but we are always very keen to support and provide the data and the analysis that we do in-house as well. If we don't have any other questions coming in at this point, maybe I'll give Larry and Xi, each of you, 1 minute for any final thoughts you may have on any of the points that were raised, any of your expectations for the year, anything we have missed so far. Maybe Xi, you can start. Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Belinda. Well, I think we've talked most of the important issues just now, and learned a lot from Laurie about the future of the clean energies in China. Yeah, I think that the most important thing in China for the energy transition and climate transition is the policy determination. So we need a strong policy signal to support clean energy and to um, restrict the fossil fuels, the coal powers development, coal development. Without that, I think it will be very hard for the clean energy sector to have enough confidence, and the coal power just will continue fighting back. And the coal power plants always reminds me of the makeshift hospitals in China during the pandemic that they built so quickly. Each province is competing building those makeshift hospitals in large scales. But when the time comes, even you build it in the name of safety to protect people's lives and everything, but when the time comes, everything just has to be gone, and people will suffer from that. The investors, people will suffer from the loss. Yeah.
Thanks. That's such a nice comparison. Larry.
Yeah, thanks. No, I'll just um, leave it at one thought, which is that um, one of the key motivators for China's decision makers to make this massive investment in clean energy has clearly been wanting to secure the leadership in this sector in the world. And I think especially after what Trump is doing, what's happening in the States, they're feeling very secure and very comfortable in that leadership. Like Ding Xuexiang was basically bragging about it in Davos and so on. And so the really key thing from the European perspective is that we really need to try and provide some competition, and that's one of the key things that is going to motivate China to keep going.
Thanks so much. Yes, more competition towards the green energy transition. I think that's a nice take. With that, thank you so much, Larry and T, for joining us and sharing all your insights and expertise. Also, thanks very much to our colleague Chang Chung, who's been helping us in the back end, and our comms colleague who helped to prepare all of this. And thank you very much for dialing in. It's been really nice to have you. Thanks for your questions, and we look forward to staying in touch with all of you.
Thanks so much, and really keen
Thank
to hear
you.
feedback and ideas for future webinars if there's something that you'd like to see again.